Our first speaker for today is Philip Crowe, who is an assistant professor at the School of Civil Engineering and the School of Architecture, Planning and Environmental Policy in UCD. And he's going to tell us about the Department of Rural and Community Development Town Centre Living Initiative 6 Pilot Town Synthesis Report, which looks at Ballinrobe, Banagher, Boyle, Callan, Cappoquin and Castleblaney. And while we have discussion a little bit further down, I think what we can do is we can take some questions in the chat function as we go through it, and we can pick some of those as we work our way between papers as well. So if there's anything that strikes your clarification, I can read them out and direct them to the various speakers. But without further ado, I'd just like to welcome Philip. This isn't a report that was commissioned as part of the HTI, but normally what we'd like to do is just try set a kind of a broader context for towns and urban regeneration before we get into the meat of the HTI. So over to you, Philip. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Ian. Good morning, everybody. I hope everybody can see my screen okay. I'm sharing the reader view rather than the full PowerPoint slide, so that allows me to see all of you as well, so that I don't think I'm sitting in my spare bedroom talking to myself for 15 minutes. So as Ian says, I'm going to give a presentation on the synthesis report for the Town Centre Living Initiative. This was commissioned by the Department of Rural and Community Development, and I was involved in it as an author, working for a social enterprise that I founded a few years ago called Space Engagers. The report is very easy to find. It's on the government website. I actually just look it up on the government website myself when I need to refer to it. There's not much point me giving you a link there, but it's very, very easy to find. So just some background to the report. It was the program itself, the Town Centre Living Initiative program, was launched back in October 2018. There are 6 towns, and Ian has just gone through them. The department promises me that there was a rationale behind that to do with geographical spread and having a various scales of town, and it wasn't just because the 3 beginning with B and 3 beginning with C, so that would be easy to remember. There was €100,000 available to each town. I don't know that each town has spent that entire sum. They were asked to develop innovative proposals that encourage the reuse of vacant and underused buildings in town centres for living. And they were asked to take a holistic approach, focus on a specific area. And the authors of the report then, so that was the programme, and now this is the report, were myself, Madeleine Lees and Orla Murphy. And you can see the list of towns there, and it does include Callan, as you suggested, Minister. So we were asked to do a report. We were not actively doing the actual program and the pilot towns. The purpose of the report was just to set out what had happened. It was to record this program, which was a very innovative program and nothing quite like it had been carried out before. And then we were asked to synthesize the findings and make some suggestions as to what is coming out of this exercise, what has come out of this pilot project. So just in terms of methodology, we had a lot of data to go from, and we looked at various reports and presentations, and we also ran a workshop in Navan, which amazingly is about it's well over a year ago, and we carried out interviews, and there was an Oireachtas committee that we looked at the presentations that were made by the 6 pilot towns. So there's a little quiz to start off with. I hope you can all see these maps. So the towns were Banagher, Ballinrobe and Boyle, Cappoquin, Callan and Castleblaney. So if you can figure out which one is which, your urban morphology test here, I will not take too long and not give you too long. So here's the answers. So each town, obviously they're all a different size, and they all took a very different scale of study area as well. For each town in the report, we give a report on the context, and we look at the different all these different headings, and then we sort of sum it up by summarizing the issues that arose for each town, and then the potential solutions that came out of looking at that town. I'm not going to go through this table, don't worry, but it's a summary table that's in the report if you want to just quickly dip in and find out, you know, what towns we're in and how do they differ. As you can see, the top row, the population, they're very small towns. They're ranging from 700 people to 3,600 people. That reflects the fact that the Department of Rural and Community Development is sort of, the remit is for towns under 10,000 people. So they all took quite a different approach. So if we look at Cappoquin, they focused in on a block of buildings in the very center of the town. They talked to the owners, they engaged with the owners, and they negotiated the purchase of one or two properties, I think. And they engaged some consultants, and they're hoping to provide an exemplar. Then in Castle Blaney, which actually I was involved with Shaftesbury Architects, and the Monaghan County Council gathered together a whole lot of preliminary data, appointed consultants, and then carried out some property clinics, we called them. The first one was about listening to property owners of vacant property. Then a capacity building workshop to see who could work together, the idea being that we need to work collaboratively on these towns. And then a third workshop, which was about how to move forward. I apologize for the lurid color in this slide. I didn't quite realize it, but all of the towns gave very interesting and a very broad range of reasons for vacancy. So if we look again at Cappoquin, it's a lot to do with the fact that the chicken factories closed down, etc. There's really very few families living in the town. Parking came up, as you might expect, every so often. But interestingly, in Cappoquin, some of the houses are just too small. They don't fit modern life in any way, so that's quite challenging. In Castle Blaney, there was a lot of talk about needing supports. There are some very complex legal issues to do with property ownership. And then a lack of private amenity space, for example, with some of the properties that are right onto the street. Although in Castle Blaney, there are extraordinarily long gardens, as there are in many towns. Potential solutions were put forward by each town, and there's a broad range of them. So in Cappoquin, they were looking at setting up a regeneration agency, an entity, and they had a plan for how to move forward, and they were going to do a demonstration project. And then in Castle Blaney, they were looking at how could they get owners to collaborate, and what would need to be in place for owners to actually collaborate, so that you were working not as individual properties but as groups of properties to realize the potential of the properties and to address the limitations. So I'm not going to go through each town because we would be here all day, but I suppose there are a number of things that stood out for me looking at this. One of them is that this is a really unique exercise in talking to people on the ground who own these properties, and believe it or not, that is fairly rare. That doesn't happen that often. Now, where it does happen, obviously, is with local authorities, because there's that connection to communities. And it was a very interesting process. A lot of interesting data came out of it. A huge amount of data that needs to be mined, I think, so that we can fully understand the reasons behind vacancy, because they are complex. Just as Virginia was saying, towns are complex. The reasons for vacancy are extremely complex, and they are not just about finances. Obviously, finance is a major part of it, but they're also about supports. So how do you address gaps in knowledge and expertise and build capacity within the community to do what are very complex processes then? Then there were issues of imagination. So seeing the potential of the town or seeing the potential of a property. And then confidence was one that I stupidly possibly hadn't thought through, and that why would I invest in this town if I don't have any confidence that the town is going in the right direction? If I invest in my property, how do I know what's going to happen to my neighbours? You know, perhaps there'll be some activity or some use in my neighbouring property that that won't benefit me, or maybe I'm going to be the only person on the street who has invested all this money in doing my property up. Then another lesson learned, I suppose, is that if you have a small group of people, now a dedicated project team. So each local authority associated with each town had a group of people looking at this. Now, they weren't exclusively, obviously, working on it, but it is impressive how much progress was made just on that one town by having a dedicated group, because all of them managed to put together a lot of data, came up with various innovative projects, and built up momentum and trust with the local community and came up with future plans. So again, if you look at Cappoquin, they've come up with some really innovative solutions, and I see Morris is on the call. So they're looking at an adaptation of a rolling development model. So profits of one sale support the next, adaptive reuse. They are looking at an incentive scheme to bridge the gap between property values and development costs, addressing the return on investment issue, and looking at a one-stop shop idea to provide supports and advice. And then what was really evident is that a cross-cutting approach is needed at all levels and between all departments. Towns do not sit in one department or in one agency, and there is a need for some sort of cross-cutting agile entity that can work between all of these different agencies, drawing it together and providing a focus. So we took all of the findings from these pilot towns and we put them in an absolutely head-spinning matrix to try and synthesize them. So I suppose this is the synthesizing element. And I suppose I'm showing you this so that the proposals or the potential suggested actions that have come out and are recorded in the report did not come out of thin air. They're not things that we had decided we wanted to put in. They are grounded in the 6 pilot towns. And we identified where different issues arose in which towns and where different ideas came up in different towns. And what I'm going to do is just go through a few of them. I'm not keeping an eye on the time. I think I'm okay for time. I'll talk about maybe 3 or 4 of them, if that's okay. So there are 15 suggested actions in the report. The first one, the issue that it's responding to, is that there's a lack of coordinated national support for towns, which we just inferred in a couple of slides ago. And the suggested action was the establishment of an Ireland's Towns partnership based heavily on the Scottish model. So just to go through that, the issues arising are there's no single national body, a lack of agreed cross-departmental approach. Towns don't fit in one department, as I say. Towns are everything. They're very complex. They are very much cross-departmental. Also, the idea that small changes in a few towns in a piecemeal way are not going to have the impact that's needed. And we need to have a bigger scale view of this. And maybe look at streets, maybe look at entire towns, maybe look at urban blocks. Also, that relevant projects can occur in isolation and they can be excellent, but there's a lack of lessons learned, or you can have a pilot and then not actually learn from that and repeat it perhaps elsewhere. And a lack of shared knowledge and support, and also too much of a reliance on voluntary groups who are often overstretched and don't have enough resources. So what we're suggesting in the report is an Ireland's Towns partnership, and I'll describe the Scottish one in the next slide. And this would be a hub in the diagram. I don't know if you can see my cursor. It would be in the centre there, coordinating action on towns, basically, overseeing the building of a national evidence base, because we do have a lack of data on our towns, putting together toolkits and guidance, sharing knowledge, supporting towns in various ways, providing link, and then critically providing links with existing initiatives such as the excellent collaborative town centre health check, which is on the ground in towns, providing baseline data and engaging with community groups in a very dynamic process, obviously run by the Heritage Council, and then also looking at the larger sort of higher scale research and evidence base in the Centre for Irish Towns in UCD, which is I'm going to talk about just at the end. And then in the middle of that, you have Irish Towns. And there would need to be on the Ireland's Towns partnership a governance setup which would involve reporting and connection at a very high level in government, a board representing all sectors that are relevant, and making it a cross-party, non-partisan representative group, and then also a large membership network. And as I say, that is based on a very successful model in Scotland that has existed in some form or other since 2008, but was launched by a towns minister. They had a minister dedicated to towns, but also critically, apparently, a very, very strong support from the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, and with reporting and meetings directly with her for quite some time. It's a tiny organization. It's about 3 to 5 people, and it's really about making bridges and connecting and networking and making sure that knowledge is shared and bringing together different funding opportunities. It's actually a social enterprise. It's a small not-for-profit. So it's not actually a government agency, but it receives funding. And there is an appendix in the document if you want to have more information on that. And the Heritage Council has close contacts with Phil Prentice, who's the CEO of it. And he has spoken. I know many of us have been at workshops on that. So another suggested action in the section on supports was to do with appointing town centre officers or a management team in a town. So the issue arising here is that many property owners need help in bringing properties back into use. So just to elaborate on the issues arising, so it's a complex process, adaptive reuse, for anybody to take on. And there was a general consensus that it is quite difficult to get the advice. It can be quite daunting, the whole thing. Protected structures came in for a bad time with a lot of towns, and they're perceived as being very complex, very difficult to do things with them, and placing limits on people. There was a lot of talk about how relocating and downsizing can be challenging. So you have a small number of people living in large properties, and there's a lot of challenges in terms of legal problems. So this idea is that there would be a dedicated person for a period of time or a small team. And this is an idea that was explored in the Castleblaney pilot town project. And that person would be gathering data, bringing people together, providing the glue or the bridge for people to collaborate. Because if there's not something there, it's not going to happen. But also critically, somebody who is driving forward change so that it is focused and bringing people along with the change. This person or this small team could relate to the Irish Towns Partnership, perhaps in a similar way to heritage officers and local authorities relating to the Heritage Council, and they could relate to a specific town or a small group of towns. And they could work through a one-stop shop model where resources from local authorities or elsewhere could come in on a certain day. Again, all of these suggested actions are grounded in precedent. They're not way out there ideas. They exist in other places and seem to work well. Just one example is a French scheme, the Revitalisation des Centres-Bourgs, which is a programme run by the French government by various different agencies. But equally, you could look at examples like, say, a town architect in Ireland. There's been various examples, say, in Westport that have worked in similar ways where you have an individual driving the change. So this example, the Revitalisation des Centres-Bourgs has a dedicated project manager that is put into a town for a number of years, and they draw together funds that are not just from heritage or not just from retrofits, they're also to do with accessibility, and they bring it all together and then drive things forward. And I worked on a report for the Heritage Council and the Housing Agency that looked at this as a precedent called Incentives for the Reuse of Vacant Buildings in Town Centres, which is on the Heritage Council website. So another example is number 4 there, strengthening legal supports to facilitate easier and clearer ownership change. Legal issues came up many times, and particularly I can recall coming up many times in Castleblaney. There's all sorts of reasons, things like a lack of instructions in a will, for example. There might be family issues, a lack of clarity on legal title. It can be difficult to identify ownership. And the suggested action is supports, basically, but also something like a use or sell incentives to sort of encourage people to actually get on with selling the property. So one example there is a compulsory sales order, which is, as you might anticipate, a version of compulsory purchase order, except that the local authority doesn't purchase. The local authority makes sure that the property is put on the market. And there are a number of precedents for that, and they're trying to bring it in Scotland. They seem to be a bit delayed on it. Then other things like a free and open land registry, there's a lot of calls for that in the UK. Here would be extremely useful as well. And then also understanding and using other legal structures for alternative tenure models. Then if we move on to financial, suggested actions under the finance and resources section, exploring financial disincentives for vacancy and underuse. So this is basically just looking at the fact that it's often easier and less risky for owners to just leave the properties vacant, which is not helpful. And that there needs to be financial disincentives to discourage long-term vacancy. At the moment, it's the opposite. So there's a number of ideas in there. I have personal preference, I think, for the land value tax, which, as we all know, is a fair tax system, and perhaps it could be introduced with credits for properties that are in use. But also there are other mechanisms. So that's the sort of suggested action that are in there under the financial supports. There's also a number under imagination and vision, which I won't go through, but it's a lot to do with communications and creating aspirational models, etc., and helping people reimagine their towns and their town centres. And then there's confidence and motivation suggested action to resource and support local authorities to invest in and demonstrate confidence in their towns. So that might be to do with public buildings or public space. But I'm just going to look at one under approach, which is a much larger scale idea, looking at the role of towns in the climate emergency, because I know there's an emphasis on sustainability and climate change adaptation in the town this year in the Historic Towns Initiative. So suggested action 14 is support towns as centres for the national low carbon transition. So I suppose this is based on the idea that revitalisation of town centres to create resilient and sustainable communities is actually an example of climate change adaptation, because you're taking existing infrastructure, so buildings, roads, utilities, etc., existing materials, and you're using them and not creating new. So I mean, it's a very basic argument, and we find looking at the pilot towns from the data that came out of them, that there is a lack of recognition of the benefits of reusing buildings in terms of embodied energy or embodied carbon, as well as to do with a sense of place and belonging, and that town centres have huge potential for sustainable communities and supporting sustainable patterns of living. And then also that in terms of the low carbon transition, towns have the potential to act as distributed centres for change. And then there's a number of supports and advice that could be provided to help that, including upskilling of the construction industry, which the Minister's just mentioned. I mean, these are not necessarily saying these things aren't happening, it's just highlighting that these things will really help. And then positive energy communities or sustainable energy communities, and looking at community-owned renewables, smarter travel initiatives, bioeconomy, circular economy initiatives, etc. So it's just full of ideas, and I hope that the report is something that is useful to people, that triggers ideas and initiatives. Another source of ideas, the Heritage Council took the initiative to put on a podcast series just at the end of last year, where Ali Harvey, I think, is discovering a new potential career as a broadcaster, a new talent. And there's a number of interesting people on that, myself excluded, who talk about different ideas and the different understandings of what's going on in towns. And it is well worth the listen. It's actually really interesting to use different media. So it's all part of the Collaborative Town Centre Health Check initiative from the Heritage Council. And there is a momentum. There's a lot of things happening. I'm not fully up to speed. The Minister would be better to talk about where we're at in terms of the Town Centre First policy. I know there is an interdepartmental group has been formed. My colleague Orla Murphy is on, I think, advising that group, or she's in some way associated with it. Then obviously, as the Minister inferred, COVID is a huge issue. I'm not going to try and start to talk about it, but it could have a huge influence on towns, negatively, positively, no one's terribly sure, probably a mix in the future. And I just put a quote up there from Dave McWilliams. It's very much in the public discourse. Never a man to shy away from a catchphrase. He's talking about a thing called the Great Switch, which would be to do with towns becoming more commercial and city centres becoming more residential. Whether that is borne out, I'm not sure. We could have a separate debate on that. And then also there's this Centre for Irish Towns, which Orla and myself have initiated in UCD, although it's to be an all-island thing. And I'm just showing this diagram to sort of remind you how it could fit in, that you would have an Ireland's Towns partnership with all its governance in the middle, coordinating everything, but there is a role for research in this, and we are very keen to try and coordinate that and bring that together on a shared island basis. And so we've started this centre in UCD. It's responding to a number of things like lack of data, lack of joined up thinking in the research world, which obviously is reflected then in the real world. Well, not the real world, but it's reflected reflected generally. And we are setting this up so that we can collaborate with different researchers across many different disciplines, but also with organisations outside the research world to collaborate on funding and bring together diverse perspectives, create networks, and with the main idea of influencing policy and supporting change and new ideas. And we're making strong connections with Queen's and with the University of Edinburgh so that we can bring in that Scottish connection. And we're dividing it up into themes, and so far they are as listed on the slide, and we will hopefully build up teams under those and work between the teams to bring in funding and to work on projects that are relevant to various different agencies or the government. And we've carried out a number of workshops to try and figure out who's out there, who's doing what research, how can we coordinate it, how can we bring it all together. And that's just an impossibly complex diagram that I tend to put together, but just showing the different themes and how different projects can be brought together with different entities and how it all relates to the sustainable development goals and how the governance might work. Okay, so that was a rather speedy tour through the Town Centre Living Initiative synthesis report. So I'll just end there. So thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Philip. That was fascinating. And just to reiterate what Martina said in the chat, if you have any questions, pop them into the chat button and we'll work our way through them that way.